Beaches were once segregated, which means that people of color were not allowed on places like South Beach unless they were going to work. So how was South Beach integrated? How did blacks eventually get the opportunity to go to South Beach just to enjoy it instead of just going to work? Well, to answer that question is to do this. It's to thank Reverend Theodore Gibson, Mr. Oscar Range, and Mr. Garth Reeves for putting pressure on politicians and leading persistent, consistent, and peaceful protests on the beaches. The protesters would put on their beach clothes, get in the water, and enjoy the beaches. That's pretty much how they protested. They enjoyed the beaches with the knowledge that they could possibly be arrested, possibly get beat up, or possibly even be killed. Reverend Theodore Gibson, Mr. Garth Reeves, and Mr. Oscar Range were always prepared to talk to the politicians and always came with the evidence that, yes, blacks are entitled to enjoy every beach in South Florida. And at a point, the politicians just never responded, never really talked, never really argued with them. So how did the beaches get integrated? They just got integrated. It just kind of just seamlessly happened. And when I say they were unbothered, I mean that they weren't really touched. Yes, sometimes the whites or the police would threaten them, but the protesters would just keep going until they were hurt or arrested. And it just didn't happen, really. And if an issue did occur, such as a protester getting arrested on South Beach or Crane Beach, there would simply be a lawsuit, and the authorities knew what the outcome of that lawsuit would be. The people of color would win. And yes, people of color did have the Virginia Key Beach, but it was time to expand and get equal rights, just like everybody else. But let's change topics for a minute. It'll all make sense, I promise. People of color in South Florida did not always have a voice. It's amazing the technology that we have to get stories and information out there. But let's go back to the Jim Crow era, the late 1800s and early 1920s. When publications wrote stories or articles about the going-ons in the black community, the stories were often minimized and weren't in depth. With that being said, we can truly be grateful for people like my fraternity brother Henry Reeves, who started the Miami Times. Brother Reeves' relationship with journalism started as a young boy. He was actually an apprentice for the Nassau Guardian, which is one of the biggest newspapers in the Bahamas. Born in 1882, he attended public schools in Nassau and was tutored privately in university studies. Brother Reeves would eventually, along with some of his partners, start the Magic Printing Company. In the midst of having this company, he needed the materials for it to operate. So he took a trip to New York. On his way back to the Bahamas, he stopped in Miami, and he realized that blacks didn't have a voice. Fast forward in the year 1923, Brother Reeves created the Miami Times. One of the things that the Miami Times is famous for, in my opinion, is its obituary section. We all have an auntie or grandma who would always pull the Miami Times or purchase one to simply find out who passed away the week prior. It's more than an obituary section to me. To me, the obituary section of the Miami Times symbolizes the closeness of the black community. 9 times out of 10, when auntie or grandma pulled the Miami Times, they knew someone who had passed away the previous week. The Miami Times paper that's here in black and white is the June 1st 1957 edition. And what's really cool about this paper is that this is one of the papers, of course, that was printed under the leadership of Brother Henry Reeves. And again, Brother Henry Reeves is the actual founder of the Miami Times. What's really cool is that Brother Henry Reeves' great-great-grandson is now the current owner of the Miami Times, and the one that's in color that we can see here was printed under his leadership. Mr. Garth Reeves said this: "Our biggest stories in those days were the number of lynchings going on around the country. Imagine that being your main story. We angered a lot of people, but we kept the fight." Now it's time to bring this full circle. If you haven't figured it out by now, Mr. Garth Reeves, one of the men I mentioned earlier in the video, is the son of Brother Henry Reeves. And just to give you a refresher, Mr. Garth Reeves is one of the men who led the fight to desegregate the beaches here in South Florida. Now we're in the early 1940s. Brother Henry's son, Mr. Garth, received his degree in print studies from Florida A&M University and would serve in World War II for about a year. Okay, now let's take a moment to analyze. Let's analyze the fact that Brother Henry Reeves' son went to serve in World War II. He would be overseas, he would be in Europe, and he would experience a whole different world. A world where blacks were not being treated as badly as they were here in the States. He brought that energy of what positivity could be back to the States. He came back and he got right to work at the Miami Times under his father, Brother Henry Reeves. Brother Henry Reeves is one of the charter members of the Rho Sigma chapter of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated here in South Florida. However, Mr. Henry Reeves' son, Garth, joined Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. I'm not for certain if he joined in undergrad at FAMU or if he joined after he graduated. However, he is pictured here with the glasses, and I believe this is the Sigma Alpha chapter of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. This picture had to be taken between the mid to late 1940s. And that's Mr. Garth Reeves right there.